All right, we'll go ahead and get started with our next session. We've got Dr. Richard Cody online with us, and he's going to give us a presentation on the NOAA Fisheries MRIP Fishing Effort Survey. I know some of you may have seen this in other venues. We've had this presentation at the South Atlantic Council, so we appreciate Richard being here with us, and he's going to go through his presentation, and at the end of that, we're going to have some time for questions. One of the things I just want to prep everybody for, I think we need to put some thought into how this body is going to respond to this. You know, this is bringing in some uncertainty into the situation, even more so than we've been dealing with. So I think it would be good to have some good, honest, open discussions about how do we move forward. We did this at the South Atlantic Council, and so I'll be looking for that once we get the presentation and we have a chance to interact with Richard. So, Richard, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I think so, Spud.
All right, well, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. The presentation that I'm presenting today, Spud made the point that we've done this at several other venues as well. We do have a more in-depth discussion of the results from different pilot studies, and we are presenting that to the South Atlantic Council, SSC, at the end of this month. So if people are interested in getting more details, that could be another venue. For this presentation, I have really just a handful of slides that summarize the results and then our next steps in terms of what the Office of Science and Technology is planning to do. So if I could have the first slide, please. Next slide. So early, I think about a month ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that at this point, we released a report, and the report garnered quite a bit of attention, namely for the results of one of the studies, which looked at a question order change. And in this study, basically, we had a systematic reduction in the estimates of effort. So, and there's a substantial reduction, close between 30 and 50% for shore-based fishing, and then up to 20-30% for private boat fishing. But the report itself contained a number of different findings based on a couple of different studies. So I'm going to kind of try to provide context for the report and a little bit of additional information on the other study as well, which has meaning in terms of our way forward and what we plan to do in the future. So there were two studies basically. One looked at 1 month fishing activity questions, or 1 month waves. Currently, the fishing effort survey, which is used to collect effort information on a household basis, works on a 2 month wave process. So 6 times a year we collect data after following a wave, a 2 month period, and then summarize those results throughout the year. This first study looked at reducing that period from 2 months to 1 month. So that's one of the studies that was included in this report. And then the second one, as I mentioned already, is the one that has garnered quite a bit of attention because it did result in a significant reduction in the estimates for fishing effort. And this looked at question order changes to 2 month and 12 month fishing activity questions. And I'll get into a little bit about how the survey is structured and why this might have created the effect that we reported. So a little bit of information here on the 1 month wave study, and these are just the key points or findings from that study. So what we did was we compared the FES, current FES design to 2 different options for 1 month fishing activity questions. So as I mentioned earlier, the FES asks about the previous 2 months. So in the first treatment, or experiment 1, we asked about a previous single month. So instead of asking about a 2-month period, we just asked about the entire wave as 1 month. But in the second treatment, we asked about the previous 2 months, asking about the first month first and then the least proximate month second. So you get two pieces of information on 2 separate months individually. And this is an important thing because what this allows us to do is, as we progress throughout the year, we basically get 2 chances to collect information on a single month. So in the first month, for instance, in the first, say, application, where you ask about 2 months, we'll say July and August, then the following wave, you would overlap with 1 month. So you would ask about August and September. So you'd have 2 chances basically to collect information. And this is important in terms of providing additional sample size to the design. The findings from the study suggested that 2-month reference period of the FES wasn't a likely source of bias. So in other words, there wasn't much that we were able to determine from looking at these 3 different treatments that would indicate that there's a significant bias there associated with the current FES. Asking about the 2 previous months individually seemed to mitigate potential recall bias in 1-month estimates. So as I mentioned, we have these 2 different treatments. One is just asking about a single month. And what we found is that there tends to be a tendency anyway among anglers, they want to report their trips, but you do have a telescoping effect. In other words, they tend to pull in trips from outside the 1-month period and count those. Whereas if you provide an opportunity for them to look at, or to provide an opportunity for them to report for 2 months individually, then it's less likely to occur. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense here. So in the case of the first treatment, or the first experiment, we're looking at 1 single month. There's a tendency for anglers to pull in trips from outside that period. In the second treatment, they're less likely to do so. And then also with the current FES, they're less likely to do so as well. The drawbacks to this study is that it was very limited in its scope. It was conducted in 4 states over a 6-month period and had smaller sample sizes than the current FES. So even though the results indicated that there is a that we did find that there is an advantage to looking at the 2 months separately, we obviously would like to do a larger scale study to confirm those results. So that's the finding of the 1-month wave study. Next slide. The question order study was a separate study. Both of these studies were done separately. And what we looked at in the question order study was revising the order of questions in the pilot. And this resulted in fewer observed reporting errors or illogical responses. So what we did in this study was we reversed the order in which we ask about their fishing activity. So currently in the FES, we ask about the 2-month period first, and then we ask about a 12-month period, the previous 12 months. So they're asked about the last 2 months, and then they're asked to respond to the last 12 months. And the rationale behind this is it's a common practice in surveys to ask the easier question first. The assumption here being that it's easier to recall over the past 2 months than it is over the past year, but also that by asking about the previous the 12 months and 2-month periods in separate questions, you are sort of bounding the response for the 2-month period. So in other words, it puts constraints on telescoping information into that 2-month period. So that's the rationale behind it. And as I said, it's a common practice to ask the easier question first. So what we did in this question order study was reverse those two questions. We asked about the 12-month period first, and then the 2-month period second. And just from the findings here, you can see the resulting effort estimates were lower for shore and private boat than the estimates produced by the current design. So simply just reordering those two questions resulted in quite a bit of reduction in the estimates for the FES. And you know, in running the original FES, we did what's known as cognitive testing. So that means bringing in panels of anglers. They get to look at the questionnaire, they get to fill them out, and then they're asked questions regarding every single response that they made, and the rationale and their reasoning behind the responses and how they put them in there. And one of the things that we found is that, you know, anglers tended to express some frustration at not being able to report all of their trips if it was outside of the period that we were interested in. So there is a tendency for anglers to want to provide information when they get the opportunity. So another limitation to this study, like the previous study, is that it was conducted over a 6-month period. It used a smaller sample size again than the full FES administration. It was conducted over all of the states that the current FES is done in. So, and we did find that the results did vary by state and fishing mode. So there's a little bit more variability in the results for this this study. But again, the key finding is that the estimates were lower when you reverse those two questions. Next slide. And just to give you some sense of what the questionnaire looked like and the types of things we looked at in the 2-month, 12-month fishing activity question order experiment, we'll say. You can see on the far left, you have 3 different experimental treatments, we'll say. The first is shore, followed by private boat. And we asked the 12-month question first and the 2-month question second. In the second questionnaire, we're asking about private boat first and shore second. And we asked the 2-month question first and the 12-month question second. And then in the third, we're reversing the month order again, but keeping private boat and shore in the same order. So there's 4 different possible treatments here, including the FES current question order. But the take home here is that there weren't differences between modes. Our mode wasn't a big contributing factor to the results of the study. So in other words, you could rearrange private boat and shore, and it didn't seem to impact the results. The real effect came when we reversed the 2-month and the 12-month question. So next slide. Hopefully that made sense. So the next steps, I just presented to you, a couple of the pilot studies that we've done, and there are a number of others as well. And most of these pilot studies focus on non-sampling error, on measurement error in general. So looking at different sources of bias that can enter into a survey. And this has garnered quite a bit of attention in recent years, where there are studies out there that have shown that, for instance, with some studies or some surveys, there has been a change in the demographics for respondents to surveys. So, it's one thing we take very seriously. We try to monitor the performance of our surveys so that if there is a change that we can detect, then we can do something about it. The downside of that is that, you know, a consistent or a continual improvement process means that it can be pretty disruptive to the information that's collected from that survey. And in particular, if it involves changes or recalibration of the historical time series. So for the follow-up and the next steps, we plan to do in 2024 a revised design administered concurrently with the full current design. So in other words, this would be a benchmarking study where we compare the impact of 1-month waves in combination with a question order change. And this would be done with a much larger sample size over a single year. The plan is to start this in 2024. We've gotten clearance from the White House Office of Management and Budget for Paperwork Reduction Act compliance. So that would have been the last major hurdle we needed to clear to make sure that the study got in place. We also have set up or modified our contract with the current vendor, which is Gallup, to administer the additional surveys in 2024 also. We received funding at the end of July to conduct the study, so the funding is also in place to do the study. And as I mentioned, you know, the new study design is informed by the results of the previous 2 pilot studies. But also, I mentioned earlier about cognitive interviewing or cognitive testing. That's a process whereby you bring in anglers or the public and have them evaluate the questionnaire by filling it out and then answering questions. I would say it's a soft process. It's not an entirely rigorous statistical process, but it does point to potential problems that might exist or in interpretation of questionnaires and things like that. So it's a common process that's used, and it's something that we used for the previous design as well. The revised design, as I mentioned, includes both the questionnaire changes and then the increasing the administration of the survey from 2 months to 1 month. So we'll be basically collecting fishing effort information on a monthly basis. And the study will determine a combined effect. And this is important also because it allows us for a more efficient calibration process or modification of the current calibration model by combining these 2 effects. It simplifies the model inputs. And one other thing I'll mention is that monthly sampling has been identified in the ACCSP Regional Implementation Plan, or is consistent with the Regional Implementation Plan priority to increase the frequency and the timeliness of fishing effort information. So that's one other box that the study checks as well. So next slide. So the follow-up and the next steps. We have an existing FES calibration model, and as you may recall, this was reviewed previously by a panel consisting of council SSC members and CIE experts that are used to review the stock assessment results as well. So the model was approved by that panel. Obviously, you know, there's some updating that needs to be done to incorporate the new changes to the FES, but in talking to the consultants that were involved in the development of the initial model, they see this as a logical step to just modify the current model to incorporate those changes. So this calibration work we have already started based on the limited data that we have available from the previous pilot studies. So we're able to at least start training the model the calibration model, so that when information becomes available in 2024, as soon as it's available, we can incorporate it into the calibration model. So we expect that throughout 2024, as the monthly wave information becomes available, that we'll be able to incorporate it directly into the calibration model and update that so that we have a completed model by the end of, what I should say, by the middle of 2025, which was when normally the annual estimates would be available for 2024. So we would expect to finish by that time and be ready for review. The full implementation of an improved FES design, if all things go well, would occur no earlier than 2026, and that would be dependent on a number of different factors. And obviously, we need to complete the follow-up study and the calibration updates. And importantly, a favorable technical review would be needed also to look at and an updated FES transition plan. And this is developed in coordination with our partners on the MRIP transition team for both the Gulf and the Atlantic. And so we're in the process right now of setting up meetings to get the Atlantic subgroups and the Gulf subgroups as well, but the Atlantic subgroup for the transition team to start a discussion of the transition plan. And then also another dependency would be the development of a calibrated historic time series for catch and effort estimates, which we believe is doable in 2025, and we would need it anyway for the review of the methodology. So it's an ambitious timeline, but I think it's reasonable with those caveats that I mentioned. So next slide. So there are various assessment and management implications, and I'm not the one really that should be addressing these. I can give you my perspective on the technical impacts of the changes to the FES, but I think the council processes and the commission processes for management, I'm not going to speak too much to that. I'll leave that to the folks that are more involved in that. But I believe it's safe to say the full impacts of the study won't be known until we complete the follow-up study. As I mentioned, both of these pilot studies that we're working from and that inform this current study are limited in scope in terms of the states that were covered and also the time period used, and as well as sample sizes. We do believe, though, that they do produce systematic changes, and that's a good thing in many respects, because the expectation is that we'll see a consistent change rather than something that's a little less predictable and more random in nature. And so this would probably result in a scaling of the time series rather than major perturbations to the time series. And there is limited information out there already, and I don't want to speak too much to this or put too much effort or emphasis on it, but in at least one sensitivity run where the estimates were reduced for the sensitivity run, the stock status stayed the same for that species. And obviously, there are a number of different factors that could affect that. We see different differential differences between shore and private mode in terms of the magnitude of the effects. So obviously, if there's a stock that has a large component that's shore-based, then it might produce a different result than something that has less of a shore component. So we plan to, continue conversations with our partners for programmatic improvements to try and mitigate disruptions to the assessment and management process, given that this is a disruptive process. We were tasked by Congress to respond to recommendations that were made by the national academies in a couple of their different reports. And, the focus on measurement error in the surveys is something that, it is consistent with that direction from Congress as well. Although I think that in the case of any kind of a sample-based survey, it's important that we monitor the performance of the surveys. So, that's something that we have been involved in and will continue to do as we move forward. I think the challenge for us is communicating those pilot studies and the need for them, so that there aren't, we'll say, at least there's less disruption to the management process. So I'll leave it there. I think that's the last slide.
All right, thank you, Richard, very much. All right, so there's an opportunity for questions for Richard. All right, I've got John Clark to start us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Richard. Just a couple of questions, quick ones on the time frame. So until 2026, when this is redone, the estimates will have to be, well, you're going to have to rejigger the estimates, recalibrate for each year coming up. And then you had said early that there were illogical responses to the FES. Was that the impetus to further go into the survey and see what the problems were? And when did that become apparent that you were getting some responses that were strange?
Well, we get some illogical responses in every single round of the survey. So anytime we take a sample, there's a quality assurance process that kind of points out illogical responses. The issue with the question order study was that it increased to the point where it was much greater than it was in the current study, or in the current design. So what happened is that you would see more questionnaires that provided answers for the 2-month period that were larger than for the entire year. So that's not consistent, and that was an indication, I think, one of the indications that we may be onto something in terms of errors creeping into the survey. And this was something that wasn't picked up in the cognitive interviewing that we did earlier as well.
Any follow up to that, John?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, obviously, we've got a problem with anglers having confidence in the survey to start with. So I assume that there's going to be a big outreach component to letting anglers know all these problems and what you're doing to fix them.
Yeah, I mean, we are embarking on a fairly, I would say, a fairly ambitious communication strategy. There are some anglers that will never change their minds on the survey. But I think the point that we've tried to make in releasing this information, even though there are some caveats and there is some risk that in the follow-up study we may not get the same results. We think we will, but there is some risk when you combine these two effects that you may get something different. But I think it's important to note that in any statistical survey, there is potential for error from different sources, and that error can change over time, as well as be something that's impacted, through just anything that affects the demeanor of the respondents. So we have every survey has limitations, and we try to get out ahead of those, but realizing that in our case at least, there's a level of disruption that occurs that really I'm struggling to find a parallel in any other survey field where we have that. In general, if you go to CDC or Census Bureau, or if there's a change made to a survey, there's an asterisk beside it saying after this date you can't compare results from the previous X number of years with the new survey. So we don't have that luxury. So we're always in a situation where we have to monitor the performance of our survey, and if there are changes that need to be made, we try to vet those as well as we can, have a very rigorous review process for those changes, so that we're as sure as we can be when we get to the point where we make those changes. It's still it's a challenge from the communication standpoint, but it's also an incredibly disruptive process in terms of the impacts downstream in management and the assessments.
All right, thank you, Richard. I'm gonna go to Chris Batsavage and then Shanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Richard, for the presentation. Can you go back to slide 6, please? Okay, so the question I have is on the monthly sampling ultimately resulted in more frequent catch estimates. Under that scenario, and this is just an in general question, understanding there's differences between states and species, how would that affect the PSEs for catch estimates going to monthly sampling, getting the same level of number of intercepts that we're currently getting under the 2-month waves?
Well, obviously the intercepts are a key component here when it comes to a given species. With the fishing effort survey estimates, we do have, like I said, an opportunity to collect information on 1 month twice. So we're getting a little bit extra bang for the buck in terms of precision gains, as opposed to just going to the exact same monthly estimate of effort based on the same sample size that we use for the bi-monthly wave. But I agree. I mean, there is a point here where the question will be if there's adequate sample size to make, we'll say, significant improvements in some catch estimates, particularly for what are currently now rare event species. And I think there is the potential here to aggregate to the wave level and get the precision gains for some of those species. It's difficult to say how much of a change this would result in, but I would advocate for more additional APIS sampling to augment the FES. Currently, we don't have additional funds to do that, so there's that issue. But I do agree, Chris. The benefit would be enhanced by additional APIS sample size.
All right, Shanna, and then I'll go to Lynn Fagley.
Thank you a lot, Richard, for being here today. I think this was a really illuminating presentation. I actually have 2 questions. My first question is in regards to some of the variations we might see in species. I'm wondering if any consideration or thought has been given to what might happen with a species that has more of a pulse fishery rather than something that's pretty steady. along the coast.
Yeah, well, and that's a good follow-up question to Chris's point about probably the need for additional APIS sampling to go along with this to take advantage of that. Right now, we have APIS samples that are, they're basically set up for a wave level estimate. There would probably be an advantage if we can, well, and we are working on this right now actually, partition the current wave level dockside sampling into months, so that if there is a pulse, it's not just applied at the 2-month level, it's applied at the 1-month level. So I think there's a precision gain to be had there in terms of being helpful with pulse species and rare event species. The other component is it still doesn't get rid of or mitigate the impact of a small sample size that results in, say, a large catch rate for a certain species that's maybe not reflective of the reality for that fishery. So there are some caveats here that we're hoping to be able to look at when we do the pilot study or the benchmarking study in 2024, and that's partitioning the information from the APIS or the APIS intercepts into the month in which it occurred, rather than distributing it over a 2-month period. So that should help there. So hopefully that answers your question, or at least.
That does help. Thank you. I appreciate it. Second question is a little unrelated, but I guess I was heartened to see that in general, you're thinking that there's going to be a scaling of the time series, however, not very large individual disruptions. I was kind of wondering what about the pilot study has kind of led you guys to that conclusion that it should just be a change in the magnitude of effort estimates, but fishing activity patterns should essentially remain the same?
Well, there's a level of consistency between the state level results. So for instance, in most cases, we see the same trend, a reduction in the estimates based on the different states that were involved. I'm a little bit hesitant to put a lot of emphasis on that because, as I mentioned earlier, it was a 6-month study, so we have limited data from a certain point in the year. There's some reason to believe that, for instance, in the less busy parts of the year, there might be more of a tendency for anglers to draw in fishing trips from outside of those periods. So we might see a larger effect for the unsampled period, based on this current study, when we start looking at the entire year. So there are some caveats there. And then there are some indications as well that in states where you have less seasonality in fishing, that there is a tendency, or less of a tendency, for anglers to draw in or to telescope trips from outside that period into the current period because they have more trips to report in general. So that's something that we're trying to keep an eye on as well. But we do believe that for the most part, the results are fairly consistent between states.
All right, Lynn, and then I'll go to you, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Richard, very much. I think Shan asked one of the questions I was going to ask, but I wanted to follow up a little bit on both something John Clark said and also on Shanna's question. And the first one is about public outreach. We, in the process of talking to our constituents about striped bass, when you look at the catch history, there's that large spike in striped bass recreational catch in 2022. And, you know, the immediate response that goes around the room is that that's not real. That's this problem with MRIP. So I think it would be, I don't know how to solve that, but I think, as John was alluding to, some real outreach on where this comes into play and where it doesn't would be very helpful, even if in the form of talking points, you know, for the states. The other piece is, you know, there's really two places where these numbers, well, there's more than two, but I'll start with two. The two main places where these numbers come into play are obviously stock assessment, and perhaps that'll be a scaling effect and won't change our stock status. But the other place is allocation. And that's where the numbers start to matter. Well, I mean, they matter no matter what, but allocation is where I think there's a greater potential to have the rug pulled out from under us. And I don't really know if that's a question, but maybe more of a thought question for this body, you know, as we're moving into things like cobia, which is a pulse species. And is there a greater odds that we're going to have a more dramatic effect on something like cobia? And how should we proceed? I mean, how, I guess I would even ask you what your thoughts are. You know, is this, are we stepping into a maelstrom here if we go forward with the numbers we have without waiting for results? So lots of questions. I don't know how clear those were, but, you know, we appreciate the work. And I think as much as we can do to really clearly help the public understand, and me too, the states too, what's happening here would be beneficial. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just refer to some of the work that we're currently involved in with the Southeast Science Center. And, you know, this is in the early stages at this point, but it basically follows up on some work that we did on rare event species a few years back. And, you know, with COVID and trying to get the surveys back on, you know, during that process, it got dropped. But it's now to the point where we are looking at different ways to, you know, or at least a decision process for alternative estimation for rare event and pulse species, for instance, where you do have sporadic intercepts that indicate there is catch, but at the same time, it's inconsistent. So we're looking at things like multi-year averaging, things like that to try and help out with that. But one thing that does show some promise, and I don't want to put too much pressure on, you know, on my team and on the Southeast Center in particular, but there are some small area estimation techniques that involve looking at auxiliary sources of data, such as, you know, regulatory data, that can be used to modify sample weights and what have you. I mean, this doesn't get around the sample size issue for many species, but it does give you some options for handling species that have, we'll say, you know, less consistent information, or where the samples are sporadic at best. So that's something that we are working on. I think it'll be important for us to communicate those efforts as we make progress. I also think that there's, you know, some lessons that were learned from the rollout of the FES back in 2018, in terms of, you know, we thought we had a pretty good communication strategy. We went to all the councils, the commissions, and presented at multiple venues. But it didn't really resonate, I think, until 2-3 years later, that we're talking about, you know, a huge change to the estimates overall. This time around, we're talking about a reduction that's not near on the scale that it was in the original survey, but it's still a disruptive process. And I think that, you know, we have learned some lessons. I think that we are making a more concerted effort to try and reach out and make ourselves available for, you know, venues such as this to get the information out. And we're taking advantage, I think, of some of the goodwill from the councils and and the commissions to help us with that process as well. I think, but one thing I want to kind of point out, and it's sometimes lost because we tend to think of fishery surveys as being equivalent. Information from one survey should be compatible or equal to another survey. And we've seen from the Gulf, depending on the survey methods that you use, you get very different results or very different estimates. So I think what this has done is it's drawn attention to the fact that there are limitations to our ability to compare, we'll say, recreational and commercial catch that comes from different surveys or different data collection methods. So I think that's a good thing in a way, because it may allow us to explore different avenues, say for allocation and other management challenges such as that.
All right, we'll go to Jason and then to Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Richard. I really appreciated the presentation, and kind of helped me understand the process and the map that you guys have moving forward. I'm just making a couple of comments, and I think the end is advice. So, the first thing I wanted to comment on is I appreciate NOAA Fisheries sort of identifying this and taking some action on it, and thoughtful action to address it. But really, most importantly, I appreciate NOAA Fisheries being forthright about this and kind of bringing it forward early, and it's just helpful that we get to kind of think about this and process it, and it didn't get kind of popped out there at sort of a last minute or something like that. So I just wanted to offer appreciation for that. I'm going to drill into what Lynn and Shanna both kind of started to talk a little bit about, and that is on that last slide you had there, you talked about the trends not changing and potentially not impacting stock status. And I agree with all of that. That's been our experience. The last time we went through a kind of a shift in our understanding of recreational fisheries, but as both Lynn and Shanna noted, it does scale the population, and when you scale the population, that scales the amount that can be removed and impacts things like quotas and things like that. And so you all know that already. I guess the advice I was going to offer, and you touched on this, but just to drill into it a little bit more, the kind of follow up to this. So you run through your larger design, you get some information that you can then calibrate, take action on, you make your adjustments, and then that subsequent step of thinking through, okay, so what are our focus species? So do we concentrate on species with high recreational components first, because they're likely to have the larger impacts? So it's more calculus than addition, I think, because there's time frames of when things get assessed and things like that. So my advice is just think through that ahead of time. You potentially, based on your pilot, you could do a little simulation work to kind of understand some of the targets you might have for things you want to address first by way of the assessments and things like that. And so another thought that I had is this could impact some of the other infrastructure that we've built recently. And what I was thinking about is fluke scup black sea bass and the recreational demand model. And that model, is conditioned on MRIP data and a bunch of other things. And so that just another area, don't forget about that. That's kind of out there. So keep that in mind as well as something that will need to be thought about and adjusted. And then final thing is I'm going to offer you a thought of hope, and that is, as you increase the sample size, I hope all of these apparent biases just go away. So I'll leave you with that, Richard. Thank you.
Yeah,
Jason,
thanks.
yeah, Jason gets the optimism award there, Richard. So go ahead.
Can I just say something about the simulation work? That is part of the calibration work that we're doing right now. I don't know to what extent we've, expanded that to the catch level. I think it's mostly focused right now on resampling data that we have collected in the previous pilot study to simulate what we think might happen with the effort survey. But I think that's a good point. We can start looking at the impacts to estimates for certain species. Thanks for that suggestion, Jay.
All right, I'm gonna go to Jim Gilmore and then to Lauren Lustig.
Thanks, Chairman, and thank you, Richard. Very good presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Their first couple of slides indicated that one of the limitations to the initial studies were that there were only 4 states sampled. So what were those 4 states? And then secondly, moving forward, are you going to increase the number of sampling effort in terms of number of states? Because I know I've been paying a lot more attention to MRIP the last few months, and variability from different states is quite dramatic in some cases. So just if you could get a little insight into that. Thank you.
Yeah, let me see if I get this right. For the 1 month waves, we looked at Maine, Massachusetts, Georgia, and Florida. And then for the question order study, we looked at all states, but it was a reduced sample size. So you're right. We would need to do this and the plan is to do this in every state that we're currently doing the FES in, and to equal the sample size that we are using or greater for the 1 month waves. So we think that puts us in a much better position to address some of that variability that you talked about. And the 4 states that we use, Maine, Massachusetts, Georgia, and Florida, obviously there are differences there in terms of our ability to collect data over the course of a year, depending on seasonality, depending on other factors. But the plan is to have this will be a large scale study, a side-by-side with the current FES. We're not stealing sample from that. We're basically matching it or increasing it at the month level. So hopefully that addresses your question, Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All right, we'll go to Lauren and then Bill Hyatt.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Richard, for a fascinating report for us. I'm interested in the receptivity or willingness of anglers to participate in the survey at all. And for those who decline, I'd be curious to know causative reasons for that you might suggest for them declining. Thank you.
There are some issues right now with the APHIS survey, and this isn't just with our surveys, fisheries surveys. It's across a variety of different large-scale surveys where respondent demographics are changing in some cases. We have, for the FES, we've maintained about a 30 to 35% response rate since the survey started. We haven't seen really a decline there. And I think part of the reason for that is that it is a relatively simple survey. It doesn't ask a lot of complex questions. And 30%, that means 70% of people didn't respond to it. We have done some non-response follow-up studies where we get back in touch with survey recipients that didn't respond and try to get some information out of them. And that's the standard process there. It has its limitations in terms of its applicability, but that's the standard process for trying to get at those individuals that didn't respond. The other thing we do on a fairly regular basis is we pair our respondents with demographic information, health information, and Census Bureau information to get a sense of, is the demographic that's responding to the survey different than the one that isn't, and how so. So those are the kinds of things we do to monitor the performance of the FES. It's a little harder with the APIS survey because it's person-to-person interviewing. It's not a self-administered survey. So, you know, a lot depends on the regulatory environment in a particular location at any given time. So even within a state, we can have highly variable, we'll say, cooperation with that survey. And that involves a lot of active outreach by the states. And, you know, I have to say that that's been one of the benefits of the states doing the field portion of the survey, is that there is a relationship that's built with the anglers, and they're in a, you know, they're more invested in the data collection process and in maintaining, you know, cooperation with the survey. So I'm thankful for that relationship. ACCSP has worked hard on that over the past few years.
All right, thanks, Bill Hyatt, and then I'll go to Justin Davis.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk for just a minute about the surveys that are done on the West Coast states. It's my understanding that they're done somewhat differently and handled somewhat differently than here on the East Coast. You know, I've read things that imply that they're done not only differently, but might produce more precise or maybe even accurate results, but I don't know anything about it. So just wondering if you could take a few minutes and take us through the comparison between how things are done on the East Coast versus the West Coast. Thank you.
Yeah, there are a number of different surveys that are in operation on the West Coast, depending on whether you're talking about Washington or Oregon or California. California has, I mean, we're in the process of certifying some of their methods right now, and they use a combination of different techniques, from everything from online effort surveys to electronic reporting to, you know, dockside sampling that's very similar to what we do with MRIP, but has a different, you know, sample frame or design to it. And we've worked with the states to, you know, align our methods so that, you know, we have the design of the survey aligns with how they're doing their estimates. And in Oregon and Washington, there are some, the way effort is collected is sometimes in the field by boat counts and what have you. I think the West Coast is more suited to that approach, in that you're specifically monitoring certain species that lend themselves to, you know, a direct count of effort at a, say, an inlet or that type of process. So there are some differences in the way that the data are collected. There's still complemented survey designs in that there's an effort component generally, and then there's a catch component, and those are combined to give you your final estimates. I don't have a lot of information here I can go over, because there are several components here, and we're talking about probably close to 8 or 10 different survey components that combine to give recreational estimates on the West Coast. So that's sort of a non-answer, I know. I can point you to information that's available on those surveys if you want. That might be helpful. And like I said, we are in the process of certifying the California surveys, their online survey based on the Angler License Directory. So, you know, that might give you a better indication of, you know, how that study is, or how that survey is set up.
Thank you. Follow-up information would certainly be welcome. Just
Yeah.
from what I'm hearing, though, it sounds like they do not have a mail component to those surveys as far as you're aware. Am I correct?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, they had a telephone component, but that has been changed to an online approach. And that was largely for cost reasons. The telephone survey was extremely expensive. You know, it depends on the quality of your license information. And obviously their Angler License Directory online survey, or ALDOS as it's called, draws directly from their license directory. We have similar situations in the Gulf with Florida. They have their state reef fish survey, and that draws from a respondent base that's based on an endorsement or I won't call it a permit, but you're identified as a reef fish angler. So there's a license, there's a list frame that they can draw from. And I think that's the take home here, is that there's more restrictive information that narrows down, we'll say, the potential universe of anglers involved in a fishery. It doesn't fully address anglers that are not on that list. So in other words, off-frame effort, but you know, there are different ways to getting at that. And Florida uses a field method, and California uses another method to do that. So it just depends. I would say from my perspective, the FES, we use license information, but it's used to augment what we use as a sample frame, which is the U.S. Postal Delivery Sequence File. And that's a list of all postal addresses in the U.S. So it's probably the most complete list that you can get that covers licensed as well as unlicensed anglers. The problem is that because it's so general, it's not very efficient. So what we do to improve the efficiency of that is we augment it with license information that we get from the states. And all of the states, including the West Coast states, give us their license information, which we use to, you know, basically improve the efficiency of the survey. So in other words, what we do is we try to match license information with household address information, so we know who's licensed, who isn't, on a household basis, and we can draw samples at a different rate for those licensed households. So in other words, we get a higher hit rate because of that, and we weight the samples accordingly. It's a lot of information, but it points to the scaling effect that there is if you use a state-based list versus a coast-wise list, basically.
All right, Justin, you, and then I'll go to Mike Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if Jay McNamee got the optimism award, I think I'm going to shoot for the pessimism award here. Just not my normal MO, but strange times. So, you know, I'll echo what several other speakers have said. I appreciate NOAA's spirit of transparency and forthrightness around this whole issue, and had a really good discussion around the table today. But as I walk away, what I'm left with is that it will be 2026 at the earliest before we have a revision to the MRIP time series that, you know, accounts for this source of bias. And then of course that information will need to be fed into several stock assessments to adjust management targets. That's going to take some number of years. So it's probably 2028, 2029 before this issue is fully resolved. And in that interim period, I think I speak for a lot of state fishery administrators around the table, we have a real challenge on our hands talking to our public about how we are making important management decisions using this data, knowing that there is a serious flaw in it, but essentially saying, we'll get back to you in 6 or 7 years and we'll have it fixed then. I just find that unsatisfying. And I think we've had an interesting discussion around the table today about where this source of bias might matter and where it might not. I do agree that, you know, if we think about trends in effort or catch or harvest over time, it is likely that this revision is not going to affect the shape of the trend, but it will affect the values on the y-axis. And I think those absolute values do matter, particularly when I think about recreational regulation setting for species like scup and black sea bass and summer flounder, where, you know, the MRIP revision did not scale up harvest estimates and the stock biomass at the same rate. So I'm really concerned about how we are going to go to the public this winter, next winter, winter of 2025, and explain how we're making decisions based on these data without accounting somehow for this potential bias. So I guess what I'm hoping NOAA might consider is developing some interim guidance on how we might be able to use MRIP data and account for this potential source of bias when we're making decisions like that over the next few years. I understand that's a very sort of difficult thing to contemplate. We don't fully understand the bias and the magnitude and how it might vary with mode and species. But I can't see a situation where we go to the public for the next 2-3 years and explain how we're potentially restricting harvest and negatively impacting the for-hire fishing fleet, or perhaps operating with higher commercial quotas than we should be because of scaled up stock biomass when we know there's this issue with the data. So from my standpoint, I just really appreciate if NOAA would consider developing some interim guidance to help out. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment, because that's something that we've heard at nearly all of the presentations that we've done so far, is that, you know, some guidance is needed here. I'll take that back to my leadership as I have, and you know, try to report out on, you know, the progress with that as it occurs. But I appreciate, I mean, it is a difficult situation, and I think, you know, I've been involved in surveys for years, and, you know, to me, no two surveys are alike, and when you make changes to one that are as disruptive as they can be in our situation, it draws even more scrutiny to the way the surveys are developed and how they're tested and so on. And, you know, we have been reviewed by national academies twice, 3 times really, and done a number of other peer reviews. And, you know, I doubt there's a survey out there that is as we'll say, as reviewed as ours. That said, though, the situation that we find ourselves in is that, you know, that doesn't help when it comes to making changes that are as disruptive as they can be. We're trying our best to try and minimize those disruptions, but recognize that it's an uphill battle. And your point is taken that, you know, we need to probably communicate often and well on what our progress is going forward to resolve this.
Yeah, Dr. Davis, I don't think you get the pessimism award, you get the realism award, and I think that's what we're all dealing with here. So go to Mike Armstrong and then back to Shannon.
Thank you. Hey, Richard. Again, I have a comment and 2 quick questions. One is I mirror what others have said. We appreciate the work that's being done at MRIP. As disruptive as this is, it's how science works. And this is exactly the way it's supposed to happen, that studies make things better. So I remember when we went from the the phone calls to the paper surveys, effort blew up 2 to 3 times in some species. And there's a lot of head scratching of why did that happen? In your opinion, do you think this is the magic bullet? This could be the thing that explains why effort went up so much when we went to the paper surveys instead of phone calls?
Well, it's part of the reason. We know that the old coastal household telephone survey was biased, I mean, at the end of it all, at the last few years, we were getting a demographic that really didn't fish, basically. They were, the health metrics that we looked at, the demographics that we looked at, all indicated that these were folks of poor health, limited ability to access fishing, and also not of the demographic that you would expect to be out there fishing. So we know that we were underestimating. The trick for us was trying to translate what we were getting from the coastal household telephone survey to the mail survey in a way that we could at least identify what effect was due to mode, changing mode. And there's lots of studies out there that indicate, when you change mode from something like a telephone survey to a mail survey or an online survey, it can have a significant impact on the results that you get. So I think the current, or the findings that we had with the question order are more in line with what anglers, I think, interpret as the number of the amount of effort that's actually happening. Any kind of analysis that we've done with the FES that indicates that it's high, and the likelihood is that it's too high. So that when you identify a source that brings down that effort, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the answer to the problem, and that in 5 years from now, something else might not be impacting estimates as well, and led to a creep in the estimate levels over time. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we've identified a source that brings the estimate down more in line with expectations, but also has some information behind it to suggest that it's more realistic, because it does reduce the amount of what you would call illogical responses in surveys. So we're getting less of that occurring. So it's difficult to say whether we won't be looking at this again in a few years. My guess is that we have to keep on with the survey pilot studies that we have, and monitoring the performance of the survey, because nothing is forever. And if COVID has taught us anything, is that people's attitude towards surveys and towards a lot of things are changing. So over the next few years, we'll be trying to monitor as best we can.
Thank you. My other question is, unfortunately, I think this 30 to 40% has become a bit of a red herring, pardon the pun. When in fact the actual estimates, if I recall the numbers raised, they went from -19 to 110% positive, depending on the mode and everything else. Is that right?
There were some differences between the states in terms of the magnitude of the estimates. But in general, the direction or the trend was consistently lower. So hopefully that answers your question. And I think what you're bringing up, the 30 to 40%, is something that when NOAA, our communications folks, wanted to communicate this as quickly as possible, I cautioned against putting a lot of emphasis on the 30 to 40%, because it's a limited pilot study, and like you said, there's a lot of variation in there, depending on which state you looked at. And you have some states that are probably more drivers in the direction than, say, some of the other states. So I still have some reservations about the actual magnitude of the change. I think in general, the trend is probably going to be consistent with the pilot study, but we're combining it now with a 1-month wave change. So there's a potential there that you might have offsetting an offsetting change to the survey estimates.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I see this 30 to 40. It's coming out of congressional press releases. It's coming out of fishing groups. But in reality, is it true that we really shouldn't have an expectation that this bias is between 30 and 40%? It could be really quite different depending on the species. It could be much lower, could be much higher. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
it could be higher or lower. We don't know at this point, because we're basically doing, combining the two elements of the survey design change into one pilot study. So, depending on how that works out, I think, we wouldn't expect respondents, their responses to change to the effort survey, in general. But like I said, there's enough concern there that I try not to emphasize the 30 to 40%. You didn't see it in my presentation today. And in fact, if anything, looking back at the studies, the magnitude of change is greater for the shore mode than it is private boat mode. So the private boat's probably more in the line of 20 to 30%, based on the previous, limited pilot study. So
Okay.
I think, Mike, I mean, to me, in the guidance that was requested earlier, that NOAA needs to provide, I think there needs to be some probably tempering of expectations, because at this point, we need the study to be completed before we can say with any certainty, what magnitude we can expect.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
All right, we'll go back to Shannon.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And thank you again, Richard. If Justin was being a realist, I think I'll try to stick on the realist path and maybe not call myself a pessimist. But, I honestly think for, this calibration, what Justin is suggesting is that NOAA be able to give us some sort of guidance on how to react during this interim time period. And frankly, I don't see us getting that in enough time to make it actually kind of worth our while. However, something that I did want to say is I hope that NOAA leadership takes to heart that comment and that thought process, in that I completely agree with Dr. Armstrong's opening statements. This is science. This is how science is supposed to work. Everything is going to be changing. This survey is going to be living. However, NOAA needs to give us some clarity on how we can adapt to changes in the survey, because honestly, it sounds like that's not going to stop. We're never going to get to a day where we're like, now it's perfect. We don't need to make any changes. We don't need to do any evaluations. Everything is wonderful and rainbows and sunshine. We should be constantly evaluating. We should be constantly updating. But what NOAA needs to think about is when we're releasing these preliminary, data sources and saying, hey, we're going to make another change, give us an idea of kind of how we're supposed to react to that. Give us more talking points for the public, give us a little bit more thought on how we're supposed to react as managers, so that we can kind of work more collaboratively into the future to know what do we do in this time period while we're waiting for more firm results on how, the calibration is going to go. So just wanted to say I appreciate Dr. Davis's comments, and I'm kind of thinking longer term into the future, because I don't think that we're going to be heard for this round, but maybe for the next round. Thanks.
All right, thank you. We've had a good discussion. Any other questions for Richard, or just general comments? I think, the question of the moment is, well, what do you do? What do we do now? We have another source of unknown and uncertainty introduced into the equation of decision making, And absent this formal interim guidance, we're left to our own devices to deal with this. And we have management actions at various stages of progress. We've got assessments that are underway. We've got amendments and addendum. We've got lots of things that are in play that that could be affected by the bias that's been recognized in the pilot study. And so, you know, how do we deal with this sort of overall systematically, but then also recognize we need to deal with it individually at the species level. And I think every decision-making body that depends on MRIP is struggling with the same thing. I know at the South Atlantic Council, we basically set up 3 questions that we ask ourselves about everything, every action that was pending, and it resulted in us making some decisions about changes in the CDAR assessment schedule, pushing some things off into the future that will allow us maybe to have this more, you know, informative study done so that we could have more confidence that the decision we ultimately made was the best it could be. And I think that's some of what we're facing. And you know, Bob and Joe and I and Tony have been talking about what do we do. And you know, one of the things is the Assessment Science Committee is going to be looking at this. You know, what are the potential impacts? How can sensitivity runs address this bias and give us information? And so I expect that perhaps at our next meeting, we'll have a little more insight into that. I know that the respective scientific and statistical committees at the councils are doing the same thing. Richard alluded to the fact that they're having a more detailed presentation. So they're doing the same thing. But, you know, I certainly don't expect any answer today, but I think it's all something we've got to be thinking about as we later today deal with cobia and the coastal pelagics management board. I mean, what do we do? I mean, that's definitely a species that could be affected by this. I mean, it's predominant private recreational mode harvest and discards. So it's a vexing issue, not one that's going to be easy to deal with. But I think the onus is back to us to decide how do we manage this sort of risk versus reward situation we've been thrust into in terms of the timing of our decisions and the impacts of those decisions. You know, I think the NOAA leadership recognizes the situation we're in, but again, I don't think they're going to go beyond what they feel comfortable with in terms of telling us. And I think if y'all remember when we had the state directors meeting, you know, we sort of learned about this after that meeting. And then in the subsequent webinars, you know, Dr. Howell said, well, you know, it's sort of the managers that are going to have to figure out what to do with this. And I think that's where we're at. So something we're going to have to grapple with for the next couple, 3 years. And I think we'll deal with it as at the high altitude level as best we can, but we're going to have to struggle with it at the individual species level too, in terms of what do we do and what's the most responsible and proportional thing to do in regard to this. So any other, Chris Batsavage?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think you did a great job kind of summarizing what the challenges we're facing over the next months and years. And yeah, I was thinking before this presentation, I was thinking about, we were in a very similar situation back before 2018 when, you know, the FES calibration was put in place. We knew that the catch estimates were going to go up by a lot, 2 to 3 times. It's already been alluded. And for good or bad, we, you know, operated kind of under the best available information that we had, because that's the information that was used in stock assessments, and we based management on that. And of course, you know, it you know, provided some challenges and issues we had to address after 2018. But again, yeah, this is something we're going to have to collectively talk about. But just throw it out there that, you know, we've been in a similar situation before when it's come to, you know, recreational catch estimates changing.
Yes, and we still deal with those CHTS to FES calibrations lots more than we'd like to. I mean, it sort of follows us around. We can't quite get shed of it, but so our time is winding down. We're at the lunch hour. Jeff, would you like to step up to the microphone?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Richard, for the presentation. Jeff White with ACCSP. While I certainly recognize that a lot of the focus and discussion is on the management options, Richard, as you were talking about the regional implementation plan and state conduct, and there were several questions about what can be done at a more technical level within the APIS sampling, which all of the states are involved in that right now. I guess while the FES pilot is being done, Richard, I've got a question for you that'll lead to the questions that those are on the table. You know, are there some technical aspects that the states can approach within the state conduct of APIS that may help the sampling approach? You know, is there a role that ACCSP and the state conduct can play in APIS now in terms of sample allocation, you know, how to get more intercepts? Would that be a helpful approach to start in parallel while the FAS pilot is occurring? So that's kind of first to Richard, is that a useful approach? And then, you know,
we'll take any help we can get, Jeff, in terms of your input, especially from the point of view of the catch survey. Because as pointed out by Chris and Lynn and others, you know, that is a limiting factor here in the quality of the information we can expect to get back. But I think our team will be working on looking at, you know, maybe refinements to the sample draw process that I think, you know, the current site register is really set up to accommodate. So I don't see a huge lift there. That said, though, there may be some components related to fishing effort on a monthly basis, like, for instance, help from the states to get more updated information on a more frequent basis to make sure that the monthly site registers are more as up to date as we can make them. So I think we will be probably approaching it for some help in that task.
All right, our time is winding down. Jeff, any follow up on that? You good? All right, thank you for bringing that up. All right, any last questions or comments? Thank you, Richard, very much. As has been said around the table, I want to reiterate, we do appreciate the agency's transparency in this matter. You know, it's I'm sure it was not an easy thing to have to do, but it's best dealt with as transparently as we can, and I think we're moving in that direction. So thank you for what you do and for being with us this morning. So if there's not any further comments, and we will stand adjourned until 1:30, and that will be the Atlantic Menhaden Board.